Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we will be focusing on classical China, the Qin and Han dynasties. The big questions you need to be able to answer after watching this video are: first, how did the Qin and Han dynasties establish a unified empire in China? Second, what impact did Confucianism have on the Han Chinese society? And third, why did the Han dynasty ultimately collapse? So let's start with that first big question. How did the Qin and Han dynasties establish a unified empire in China? After watching this video, you should be able to start to make some comparisons between the way in which Qin and Han dynasty unified China to other classical empires like the Persian Achaemenids, the Mauryan and Gupta in India, and the Roman Empire. So the last time we were in China during period 1, we discussed how the Shang and then later the Zhou dynasty collapsed, leading to a period known as the Warring States period. Now eventually the Warring States period will end when the Qin dynasty emerges. They reunified China after this period of warring states between various noble landholders in China. The Qin dynasty was founded by Qin Shi Huangdi, who we refer to in class as the OG in world history. He was pretty gangsta. He followed legalist principles. He harshly punished anyone who didn't follow any of his laws. He started construction on the Great Wall of China, a really important public infrastructure project using corvée labor. We'll discuss what corvée labor means in a second, to prevent nomadic invasions by the Xiongnu. So the Xiongnu are these nomadic peoples on the northern boundary of China, and they were constantly raiding northern China in order to get access to all of the blessings of civilization. And so there were a number of walls that had been constructed to prevent these nomadic invaders. And what Qin Shi Huangdi did was to help create one unified system, one unified wall, which is still seen in China today. Whenever you build a massive public infrastructure project like the Great Wall of China, you're going to need labor. So the Chinese built a labor system known as corvée labor. Now this is state-imposed unpaid labor, typically for building public projects. Usually what corvée labor is you owe a certain amount of taxes to the government, or often can't afford to pay those taxes. The government will forego those taxes as long as you provide unpaid labor for a certain period of time. Usually, it's maybe a month or 2 months, 3 months out of the year where you're working on building these massive public projects. Another way in which Qin Shi Huangdi unified China was he established central bureaucracy, a very common technique utilized in almost every major empire for creating systems of government to make government more effective and efficient. For example, he created a standardized system of measures and weights. Here you can see a measuring cup. He also, in order to facilitate trade, created a standardized system of metal coins, very similar to what we saw in the Persian Empire. And finally, they created unified road widths throughout the empire, which facilitated trade, and it allowed people to build their carts to a certain width. He also ordered the execution of Confucian critics. He was following legalist principles, so he ordered the burning of Confucian text and also the execution of Confucian scholars. Here you can see them lying in a pool of their own blood. And finally, he built a tomb with an army of terracotta soldiers, this large piece of monumental architecture, very similar in purpose and function to the Great Pyramids in Egypt. It stood as a testament to Qin Shi Huangdi's power and also ensured that he would continue to rule in the afterlife as well. So there are thousands of these terracotta clay soldiers, each individually constructed. Now, upon his death, the Qin dynasty was overthrown. He ruled again with a pretty harsh hand, and therefore, not surprisingly, after his death, the Qin dynasty was seen as having lost the mandate of heaven. That is going to usher in a new dynasty, the Han Dynasty. Now, the Han is going to base their dynasty on the Confucian school of thought, on the ideas of Confucius. So if you will recall, Confucianism is based on the idea that you create order in society by having everyone know their proper place in society and to perform a series of rituals. Now, he continued the Qin model of centralized rule, but was far less harsh, not following legalist principles, but instead those Confucian ideas. One of the important rulers in the Han Dynasty was Wu Di, and one of the things that Wu Di recognized was that one of the things that Confucius stressed was education. So he established an academy that would train government officials in Confucianism, and they would, at the end of this training, take a civil service exam test. So it's going to be very important. The Han Dynasty is going to establish the civil system exam system, which was based on students' mastery of Confucian principles. But this really, for the first time, establishes a meritocracy in world history, where people are being chosen for positions of power not based upon birth, but instead based upon their intellect, their experience, their abilities. And still to this day, we see the impact of the civil service exam system in China. In Chinese high schools, in your senior year, you're required to take what's known as the Gaokao exam. And this is for placement in some of the elite colleges in China, which ultimately what people want is positions in the Chinese Communist government. It's during the classical era that China becomes connected really with the other major areas of Eurasia through a trade network known as the Silk Road. So Han China was the eastern end of the Silk Road trade network that connected China with India and Persia and the Middle East and the Roman Empire, which was the western end. And it was named the Silk Road, not because silk was the only item that was sold, but it was one of the primary items that was sold. So, how silk works. You have a silkworm that eats a mulberry leaf. Eventually, this worm forms a cocoon. That cocoon is then boiled, ultimately spun into very fine thread. Now, the reason why silk was such a hot commodity on the Silk Road was for three reasons. One, silk is very beautiful, it's shiny. Two, silk is very durable. And then three, silk is very lightweight, therefore it made it easy to carry long distances, which was a very important characteristic when it comes to transporting goods overland. So for centuries, China had a monopoly on silk production. They were the only ones who were producing silk, and therefore it was a commodity that fetched a high price along the Silk Road. Now, the Chinese are also going to develop wood-based paper. Now, previously, people had been writing on paper-like items. For example, in Egypt, they utilized papyrus, which was a dried reed that they wrote on. In other parts of the world, like the Middle East, they used vellum, which was a calf skin. But the Chinese developed the system of paper that we still use today, which is wood-based paper. Now, what impact did Confucianism have on Chinese society? So if you've ever seen the movie Mulan, that's loosely based on Han China. Now, if you can remember the scene where Mulan visits the matchmaker, who is the woman in the village whose job it is to arrange marriages. Now, if you remember, Mulan did not excel in fulfilling her duties or her rituals, and the matchmaker exclaimed that Mulan was too skinny. So Disney actually did a pretty good job of capturing the idea that Han China was a patriarchal society. Women's primary role was to bear and raise children and to maintain order over the home. The reason why China was such a patriarchal society was in part due to the ideology of Confucianism. So if you recall, one of the relationships that Confucius stressed was between the husband and the wife. And remember, the husband was the superior in the relationship. The husband was to set a good example, but ultimately it was the wife whose job it was to be respectful and obedient. And so Confucianism imposed limitations on women's power in society because ultimately their role was to be inferior to their male counterparts. So take a look at the pyramid of social hierarchy within Han Chinese society. Do you notice anything that's different? One thing that you'll notice is the high position that government officials have. So government officials in Chinese society have a relatively high social status. Remember, after the Han Dynasty, in order to get one of those jobs, you're required to do well on the civil service exam system. And so Chinese society placed a high value on those government officials. Notice too, at the bottom, you have merchants. And especially important is merchant status below farmers, soldiers, and peasants. This was because Confucius in his writings didn't value merchants. He said essentially that they were leeches within society who were making money off of other people's hard work. So Confucius viewed peasants far more favorably than merchants. Now, slavery was limited, although they did have slaves in Han Chinese society. It was only around 1% of the population. And we're going to contrast this with the Roman Empire, where a much larger percentage of the population were slaves. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have coerced or forced labor. As we described earlier, the corvée labor system was essentially a form of forced or coerced labor. Now, why did the Han Dynasty collapse? So, like Rome, which we'll discuss later, both internal and external problems are ultimately going to doom the Han Dynasty and lead to their fall. Let's start with the internal problems. There was a small landholding class in China that began to form, which didn't pay any taxes. And they were incredibly wealthy, as evidenced by this, which is a jade bodysuit. It was very common for wealthy Chinese to be buried in suits like this. There was, over time, an unequal distribution of land and wealth because the landholding class wasn't paying taxes, the peasants were paying taxes, and therefore we are going to see the beginnings of a conflict start to form between the rich and the poor, growing wealth disparity. Into this scenario, we see an emperor named Wang Mang, who's oftentimes referred to as the socialist emperor. He is going to try to redistribute land to the peasants, to take land from the wealthy and redistribute it to the peasants. Now, the reason they call him the socialist emperor is because that's a very socialist idea. And so we're going to see this problem of unequal land distribution playing out throughout Chinese history. Eventually, it's going to lead in the 20th century to the Chinese Communist Revolution, which is going to be led by Mao Zedong. So this was unsuccessful. Ultimately, these wealthy landowners rose up and crushed Wang Mang. In 184 CE, there's going to be a peasant uprising called the Yellow Turban Peasant Uprising. And this is going to be your classic example of poor people who are simply hungry, who are going to rise up and seek to overthrow the empire. It's a rebellion or an uprising, meaning it's not successful. Ultimately, this rebellion is crushed, but it's going to weaken the Han Dynasty. It's these internal threats that ultimately create weakness, which eventually is going to lead to the fall and collapse, which occurs as a result of external invasion. And who were the Chinese always worried about invading? Their northern neighbors, the Xiongnu. So in the 3rd century CE, the Xiongnu are going to invade from the north. Now, the northern Chinese are going to gradually adopt the Xiongnu's culture. And we're going to see this especially in northern China with the way in which women in northern China were treated. Because remember, in pastoral societies, women tend to have a little bit more power, a little bit more say. And so we're going to see in northern China that women were starting to gain greater rights as a result of this basically blending of social and cultural traditions. Now, eventually, the Han Dynasty is going to disintegrate into regional kingdoms around 220 CE. So what started out as decentralized rule in the Warring States period then gives way to the unification under Qin and Han Dynasties, eventually going to lead back to the disintegration into regional kingdoms in 220 CE. So, as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these 3 questions. How did the Qin and Han dynasties establish a unified empire in China? 2, what impact did Confucianism have on Han Chinese society? And 3, why did the Han dynasty collapse? Thanks for watching.